For joining us. We'll have you out in time for the next game, don't worry. A couple of housekeeping things. We're looking to end around like 5:45, 6 p.m. The bar will remain open. Please get up, grab a drink during during the conversation. But we're super excited about this panel. We have a number of really esteemed guest speakers. My name is Michael Collins and I'm a consultant with the Prosecutors Alliance. I'll be your moderator this evening. They flew me in especially from Scotland to do this. Amazing expense. But tonight's conversation is a serious conversation about the growing threat that often receives little attention. There are across the country an effort to remove, override, investigate, intimidate or politically pressure prosecutors for lawfully exercising their discretion and policy judgment, and what we try and do is put that in the context of what is a larger conversation about democratic backsliding. Today, Prosecutors Alliance releases a report called The Beleaguered Bulwark, the essential role and erosion of prosecutorial independence for the rule of law in modern US democracy, the mouthful of that title. What our report argues is that these are not isolated criminal justice disputes that we see with prosecutors. They are part of a broader attack, an effort on democracy, an attempt to weaken local democratic governance, consolidate coercive power, and erode the institutional checks within our democracy. We are fortunate enough to be joined by an outstanding panel to discuss why this matters, how these attacks have evolved, and what policymakers, advocates, and democratic institutions can do in response. I want to start by thanking the office of Congressman Jamie Rossi for giving us this space today. But in introducing our panels, first of all, we have Parisa Dehghani-Tafti, who is a prosecutor and criminal justice reform leader. Oh yeah, clap it up. Parisa is a prosecutor and criminal justice reform leader who has served as the elected Commonwealth's attorney for Arlington County and the City of Falls Church in Virginia. She has prioritised policies that emphasise fairness, transparency and public safety while seeking to reduce mass incarceration and address systemic inequities in the legal system. Under her leadership, the office has implemented evidence-based reforms, created diversion programmes, and re-examine traditional prosecutorial practices to better serve victims, defendants, and the broader community. She is a founding member of Restorative Arlington, the first local community-based programme providing restorative justice services, and the only programme doing so for both adults and youth. And she is a founding member of the Fight Against Federal Overreach, which we will surely get into, which was launched in 2026 this year by 9 locally elected prosecutors across the nation. Next up, we have Cristine Soto DeBerry. Clapping that up. Cristine is the founder and executive director of the Prosecutors Alliance. She spent a decade as the chief of staff to San Francisco District Attorneys George Gascon and Chesa Boudin. She previously served as San Francisco Mayor Gavin Newsom's deputy chief of staff and started her career as a public defender in Los Angeles County. Next up, we have Rachel Rossi. I feel like Jeb Bush here, that's my Rachel Rossi is the president of Alliance for Justice, where she leads the organisation in its bold and unwavering commitment to justice, equity and defending democracy. She came to AFJ from the Biden administration's Justice Department as the director of the Office for Access to Justice, where she led national efforts to expand... Call me here. Hey, Michael. I'm coming to you. Don't be impatient. I thought they were on silent. Okay, Rachel. Where was I? Rachel led national efforts to expand access to legal representation for underserved communities. Prior to that, she was Deputy Associate Attorney General, where she served as the department's first anti-hate coordinator under Associate Attorney General Vinita Gupta. Ms. Rossi's legal career began in the courtroom, where she spent nearly a decade as a public defender in Los Angeles County and in federal court in defending thousands of low-income clients and standing on the front lines of the fight for justice. In 2020, Ms. Rossi made history as the first former public defender to run for Los Angeles County District Attorney, earning nearly 500,000 votes and widespread grassroots support for her progressive vision of justice. She's looking forward to sharing her unique perspectives, having served on the Hill with the DOJ and directly providing legal services as a federal defender. And last but not least, my good friend Somil Trivedi, who is, clap that up, there we go. He needs these plaudits. He is the Advocacy Director and Senior Counsel at Court Accountability, an organisation focused on rebuilding structural democracy and holding corrupt government officials accountable. He previously served as a financial fraud prosecutor at the Department of Justice and a senior staff attorney at the ACLU, where he helped lead its prosecutor reform campaign. Great. Okay, so that is your panel, and we're going to start things off with Cristine with a discussion about why prosecutors matter. I said before, like anybody else is welcome to jump in as we ask these questions. But Cristine, I know that you've worked closely with prosecutors across the country and helped shape the thinking behind the report that we released today. Can you start us off by explaining why prosecutor independence is fundamentally a democracy issue and not simply, as some people might think, a criminal justice issue?
Yeah, great. Thank you. And thank you so much, everybody, for being here and having interest in this topic. It can be esoteric, I think, for some people to think about prosecutors. But I think the more recent years are putting this on the front page of our newspapers and raising questions for us about how independent prosecutors can be, should be, and what implications it has for all of us up and down our society. And I think many years, myself included, we thought about this as a criminal justice issue. And what has become very clear is that this is essential to democracy. When prosecution gets weaponized, when it becomes a political tool, it is no longer a criminal justice issue. It is about a distribution of power or consolidation of power and how we want to respond to that. I'm sure everybody in this room knows the immense power that prosecutors have and how significant that is. They're one of the few actors in society that can take away your freedom against your will. They have the power to charge cases, they have the power to seek punishment, such as prison and jail, they have the power to show restraint, and they have the power to hold powerful people accountable, something many other parts of government do not have the authority to do. And when that power is exceeded, we have to wonder what that means for our society. If it's not guided by the facts, by the law, by ethics, by constitutional obligations, community accountability, when all those things are in place, it's a great democratic safeguard. When we are missing those things, we are then using a very dangerous tool of the government outside of its traditional bounds. I think one of the main arguments we're trying to make in this report is that some of the early attacks we saw in the field of prosecution presented themselves very much as if they were about criminal justice issues. They were seen as narrow fights about progressive prosecutors or reform-minded prosecutors. And when we were actually seeing the very early steps of consolidation of power, of asking prosecution to wield to executive authority, to wield to powerful interests, and to lose and forfeit some of that independence that is so essential to our profession. And what we're seeing now, I think, as has now taken a much bigger stage with some of the federal things we're seeing. But this has been happening around the country. You may have seen, give you just a couple examples. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis removed 2 elected prosecutors from office and replaced them with his chosen candidates. No election held, just an unceremonious removal from office and replacement. One of those prosecutors ran in a subsequent election and won her seat back through that process. The other was not able to. In the Pennsylvania legislature, we've seen impeachment proceedings against the Philadelphia district attorney and severe efforts to limit his authority, but no other Pennsylvania prosecutor's authority or discretion being challenged in that same way. In Georgia, we've seen the creation of a commission to evaluate the performance of prosecutors, enabling a formation of the state legislature to remove those elected prosecutors from office and prohibit them from running again for 10 years. These are the kinds of things we've seen happening state by state and community by community for over a decade, and are now starting to show up on the federal level. We're now starting to see things like the Department of Justice firing staff, coercing prosecutions of people where line staff do not feel there's adequate evidence or facts to support a prosecution. We're seeing investigations of political targets, subpoenas, threats, and pressure campaigns, all with the intention of moving that decision-making authority from the traditional guides we use around the rule of law, the facts, the evidence, our ethics, and towards the priorities of people in power. So I think, in short answer, Mike, I think that is why this is a democracy issue. Once we have political actors that can punish prosecutors for using their lawful discretion, those threats don't stay just confined to one ideology, to one political party, to one prosecutor, or to even criminal justice. And so they can become a tool of an administration that wants to punish its enemies, that wants to protect its friends, that wants to intimidate dissent, that wants to override local voters. Now, I want to be clear that I'm not saying there should be no accountability for prosecutors. Of course, anybody wielding the amount of power that we do must have some oversight and accountability. This should not be local rule at all costs. We've had a history in this country of seeing that, and we know that that too can be dangerous. So I think it's important that these conversations are held in the principles that ground this work. We're not talking about political control. We're not saying civil rights enforcement. It's different than when we weaponize civil rights language to punish lawful discretion. Oversight is different than intimidation. And criticism is different from using state or local power to force prosecutors to serve a political agenda. So I come to this moment today after nearly 30 years working in local criminal justice systems, seeing up close the very real trade-offs that prosecutors have to make, very hard decisions on a routine basis, the real pressure that exists even outside of the moment we're living in now, of local community, law enforcement, media, elected officials wanting a certain outcome, and seeing day in and day out the people in those roles eschewing that pressure and looking purely at the facts, the evidence, the ethics that guide their profession, and doing their best to make a good, fair decision. So that's why I think this conversation is so worthwhile for us to have, that we get this outside of just the criminal justice frame, and that we start to link arms with others that are concerned about our democracy writ large, and that we make sure that when we talk about democracy, it's not just about the courts or elections, but that we think about the authority prosecutors have as an integral part of that same conversation. I'll pause there.
Great, thank you. Rachel, moving on to you, I know that AFJ and in your role as president there, you guys do a ton of work, to safeguard our democracy, and I think one of the things the report says is that prosecutorial independence is one of those democratic safeguards. Why do you think prosecutorial independence is essential to the rule of law?
Right. When we think about a strong, vibrant democracy, and we think about the pillars that undergird a strong democracy, rule of law is one of those pillars, right? And rule of law, as we know it, as we think of it, it means no one's above the law. It means due process for all. It means safeguards against corruption, political weaponization. It means that you can't buy a better outcome in the justice system because you're wealthy. And it surely means that outcomes don't depend on your political allegiance, right? And so when you think about rule of law, all of that is so tied to the independence of prosecutors. And today we're seeing, like Cristine highlighted, quite honestly the opposite in a very terrifying way. We're seeing the use of the prosecutorial function as a weapon against political enemies, the firing of January 6 prosecutors, pardons for January 6 rioters, a quid pro quo agreement to dismiss an indictment for the New York City mayor if he complied with the president's immigration enforcement agenda, politicized prosecutions like that of former FBI Director Comey, or 6 Democratic lawmakers who made a video reminding military and intelligence personnel that they have a legal duty to uphold the Constitution and refuse unlawful or illegal orders, and them being subject to prosecution. Trump even ordering the Justice Department to drop cases and dismiss charges against political allies, like the co-defendants in the Mar-a-Lago classified documents case. So, when you think about the rule of law and the independence of the prosecution function, when we look at our federal prosecution function right now, that is, core to it is the lack of corruption and the lack of weaponization of the department, right? But the reason that the prosecutorial independence function is so critical to democracy is that it goes even beyond that, because it protects all of the other pillars of democracy as well. So you think about separation of powers, checks and balances, right? Right now, we're seeing, Trump having this $1.8 billion fund where, he sued personally, the Justice Department made a deal with him in order to benefit him, right? And thankfully that unprecedented move has been abandoned. We're also seeing, willingness to disobey court orders. That is one of the core checks and balances of our system, is the judiciary and the ability of the judiciary to issue an order and for us to comply with it. So, we've seen at least 31 suits since last February where a federal judge determined that the administration has not complied with the court order. We've seen more than 250 instances of non-compliance that judges have highlighted. So, that one pillar of democracy are checks and balances. That is so easily upended when the prosecutorial function is independent, right? Then you look at, a vibrant civil society. That's another core element of a vibrant democracy. It's a civil society that is not stifled, that can speak up, that can organize, that can protest. And we see this Justice Department has the power to wage war against nonprofit organizations. So, an unprecedented move by this Justice Department to file an indictment against the Southern Poverty Law Center, an organization that has worked to fight hate for decades. The Justice Department is alleging in a laughable indictment that they are actually creating hate. And so, the ability of, like Cristine said, the power of the law enforcement function, it also has this ability to stifle civil society. And then you think about free and fair elections, right? Another core pillar of democracy. And the Department of Justice is launching federal lawsuits against multiple states demanding unredacted voter files. There are lawsuits fearing that these actions are that the end game of these actions is to illegally stockpile personal information and create a national voter database to do surveillance and state-by-state voter purges. So when you even think of free and fair elections, the prosecutorial function is so core and it has to be independent. And then the last pillar of democracy, free press, right? Like that is so fundamentally a piece of what we value as a democratic society. And then you can see how the Justice Department can investigate independent journalists like Don Lemon and Georgia Ford, who were literally covering a protest in St. Paul. And recently the Wall Street Journal reported that Todd Blanche, our acting Attorney General, vowed to subpoena journalists who report on national security issues because of Trump's frustration of media reporting on the war in Iran. So I bring up all these examples because, when we think about the independence of the prosecutor function, obviously core to that is thinking about the actual cases that are brought, that are corrupt, that are politicized, weaponized. But really, the independence of the prosecutor function is core to all of these pillars of democracy and so important.
Thank you, Rachel. I mean, it's interesting, like, even as someone who follows the news, some of that stuff I wasn't even aware of. And it just, speaks to how overwhelming it is. But I know that you touched on some of the attacks on courts, election officials, civil servants. So Neil, like, from your perch with court accountability, I'm wondering how you feel like the attacks on prosecutors that we've seen fit into that broader pattern of attacks on courts, elected officials, civil servants and other independent institutions.
For sure. Well, first of all, thank you, and congrats on this report. If you haven't read it yet, please do read it. It's, for all the reasons they're saying, is as relevant as ever, and it's going to become even more relevant as the midterms approach and prosecutors become even more important to safeguarding our democracy, so please take a look. So Rachel really hit all of the high points around these institutions, independent power centers of a democracy that can safeguard us, right? Courts, civil servants, the press, etc. What is their common denominator? They act as checks on authoritarianism. And what is the authoritarian project? To systematically undermine those checks. They have no policy prescriptions. They have the accretion of power, and these are power centers independent of them that they must bring to heel, right? And so when we see the Trump administration trying to gut the civil service and then civil society coming to their aid and filing lawsuits to support them, right? When we see the DOJ being held in contempt for violating court orders, and then you see attorneys or activists on the other side trying to bring attention to that, the press trying to bring attention to that, right? That's team defense against authoritarianism, because if they get one of us, they get all of us. So that, I feel like, is the common denominator, and prosecutors fall squarely in the middle of that for all the reasons that Cristine and Rachel said. If they are corrupted, then we have lost one key pillar in that team defense. I'm making a lot of basketball analogies here, because I know that's what everyone's thinking about. I'm just gonna put it out in the open. So I think that's the key way in which they are all similar. Now I will say, there's many ways in which this is different and unique. As Cristine mentioned, by and large, a lot of these local prosecutors are elected. So when we say that this is an attack on democracy, absolutely, when Trump terminates a grant that was passed by Congress, that's a certain kind of violation of democracy. When you try to oust an elected prosecutor, that's like a direct attack on democracy. So I think it's really important to keep this in mind, that we have a constitutional system that allows prosecutors at the local level to be elected for a reason. And so when their enemies attempt to depose them, they're not just like violating a statute, they're violating like a core directly elected power center. Another way that's important to keep in mind is that they are, how do I put this? Prosecutors have been, like they've been subject to these attacks, actually going back before this sort of fascist emergence at the federal level, right? Cristine mentioned that too, that when criminal justice reformers had the gall to organize themselves and invent this new way to do prosecution, that created a backlash at the local and state level 10 years ago, like before it was cool to attack democracy, right? And so I think in that way, it is much tougher to defend them, because we have the weaponization of the federal DOJ plus attacks on local prosecutors all around the country, right? It's not just the civil service in DC, it's not just courts in certain jurisdictions, it's everywhere, and the attack is coming from extremists at both the federal and the state level. That's going to be really tough and really requires all of our diligence. And finally, and this is really key, as guarantors of public safety, they very specifically undercut the authoritarian narrative that only authoritarians can provide that public safety, right? It is devastating to them to know that there are other people, these woke leftists, that can actually have a claim to public safety independent of them. And so that's why the attacks are so vociferous, I think, is because, and again, we're about to come up on an election cycle where all of a sudden, out of the blue, crime is gonna become their #1 claim to fame, right? The actual stats be damned, and actual results of prosecutors and law enforcement officials at the local level be damned. They're gonna ask you not to believe your eyes, and it is really imperative that, like going back to my analogy, the whole team shows up to say no. We can have both fairness and justice and safety all at the same time, and you don't need to be an authoritarian to do it. So I think those are like the key similarities and differences, and all speaking to the same need to defend this community.
Great. Well, Parisa, I know that you've probably been sitting listening to all this and thinking, they're talking about me. You are here and literally on the front lines, and I think it's really important that we have your perspective. So, you know, as an elected prosecutor, how have you experienced these pressures firsthand?
So I'm gonna talk a little bit about one of the heaviest decisions that I ever made. And that was whether or not to keep the promise that I had made to treat kids like kids. And it was a horrible case where a teenager had been drinking a little bit, and which they shouldn't have been doing, of course, and then driving really fast and hit another teenager and killed them. And I had to make this decision. knowing that I was going to heap on more pain to the family than they were already experiencing, which, I'm a parent and I know that losing your child is the worst thing that can happen to you. I would almost rather have anything happen to me than someone, no, actually I would, anything happen to me other than someone harm my child. It would have been really easy for me to play the political game of, pretending to certify this child as an adult and then, laying it on the judge's feet, that it didn't happen. And it especially would have been easy because the child and the who died and his family were my constituents, and the child that was driving the car was not. And I stood by my policy and my principles that you have to treat kids like kids, and it's not because I'm stubborn, which I am, but it's because I knew what was the right thing to do, and I knew that there was going to be an incredible backlash about it, and there was, and it's not even the most controversial decision I've ever made. Some of you are well aware that I've been subpoenaed by Congress for records and invited for an interview, and it's because I closely scrutinized a case where and decided to close the investigation of a protester who had put Stephen Miller's address on a flyer and called for a congressional investigation into Stephen Miller's action. She didn't threaten him at all in any way, but it was expressly to seek political action. And so, and I made the decision on the law that it didn't meet the doxing statute requirements, elements in Virginia, but also that even if it had, in this particular context, given that it was a public figure that she was talking about, and given that it was political speech, that she was the ask was for political speech and not for harassment or to do anything to him, that it would have violated the First Amendment. And so yes, I mean, I deal with it all the time, and I am acutely aware that these things are happening, and that every decision that we make, even the most innocuous ones can turn around tomorrow and cause a lot of harm. And the harm is not just bad press, right? The harm isn't just the normal thing that happens when people are unhappy, which is one of the pillars of democracy, is to run against you, right? Mm-hmm. The harm is, criminal charges against you that are fabricated, right? The harm is subpoenas. The harm is, your livelihood in a way that it never has been. And that's, I'm very grateful, like this report nails it on the head, and it's not an accident that it was actually in Project 2025 to take out local prosecutors. And I think we're at this point like one of the last lines standing between democracy and not democracy.
Michael, can I just
Yeah,
jump in there real
yes.
quick? Because what she said was so important about what do you do when you disagree with the prosecutor? You run against them and beat them.
Mm.
And I think that has been lost in this discussion, that you can have, as Cristine said, legitimate qualms with how people do their work. You can have qualms with how prosecutors do their work. All of us do. Plenty of them.
I mean,
right?
I did, and I ran against the incumbent in my jurisdiction.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And so you can draw parallels. We asked about other institutions. You can talk about the courts. People are talking about court reform right now. We're not talking about picking them up out of their seats and throwing them out, or charging them with crimes so that we can get them out of there. We're talking about lawful, congressionally authorized, democratically debated reforms to an institution that we believe is both important and in need of reform. We can do that with all of the institutions down the line, including prosecutors, while not devolving into violence and destroying the institutions that got here and all of that. And so if someone has a problem with Parisa, they can run against her and beat her if they want. Short of that, we gotta defend it.
I'll think about it.
So, so Neil, you touched on this, but we're here in Congress, right? And we're talking about like what efforts need to happen to protect democracy and all the dangers that are out there. Groups that are working on these issues, like what are they thinking about in terms of like what has to be done on the issue of prosecutor independence, on the issue, like what are some of the reforms that people are talking about?
I would defer if anyone else has thoughts, but Cristine?
Well, I have a lot, I don't know how much people are talking about it, that's part of what I want to have this
We're
conversation.
talking about it here.
But I think the real challenge we've seen is so, particularly at the federal level, so much operates on norms that are not codified. And it hasn't been an issue in the past because everybody abided by those norms. You don't bring a case close to an election because you might inadvertently put your thumb on the scale. That's not codified. And if we want to make sure that those kinds of inappropriate interferences don't happen, where you create some trumped up charges against somebody right as the ballots are going out, and then, oh, look at that, 3 days after the election it falls apart and you don't proceed on it. Those are the kinds of manipulations we can expect to see if we don't start codifying what has been a normative culture that really upheld the most important principles. I think there's a great opportunity for Congress to be thinking about what they could enact. There are legions of former Department of Justice employees that are eager to contribute to that conversation about the ways they did their job. Some of them are in this audience that I think if Congress would listen to them and to both of you about what should be in law that is important enough as a norm that it should live past this administration and any administration that comes after it. I think that at the state and local level, we should be thinking about removal and recall procedures that require misconduct or incapacity or corruption of some level, rather than just, we'd like a redo on an election we held 2 months ago because we came out on the losing side of it. So I think there's a whole range of reforms we should be looking at across the spectrum that would help us insulate that independence from, you won't ever insulate prosecutors from all pressure, right? I mean, we've done this job. The law enforcement's in your office and they're like, you gotta file this, seriously, it's important. And sometimes, most of the time that's true, sometimes it's not, and you have to do that. But there are these kinds of extraordinary pressures we're seeing now that are so political that really have taken us outside the realm of what's safe and what's acceptable for democracy.
I'll throw out one particular example that's pretty salient right now and sadly may become more salient in the coming months as we reach the midterms, is the previously norm-based cooperation between local and federal prosecutors when there is a prosecution of a federal official, aka ICE.
Yeah.
That is based on common law, norms, back scratching, the APA. These are all bad things to base like the administration of criminal justice on. And we're seeing that in Minnesota and elsewhere. I fear that we will see it more often.
Yeah.
And so if Congress can take that from a norm to a requirement, that the federal DOJ, if corrupted by a particular administration, cannot stand in the way of independent local prosecutors doing the basic investigation needed to determine whether a federal official has violated the law. That should be baseline, bipartisan, 100% polling. And it's not right.
Such a good point. Such a good point. We've seen that in Minneapolis in stark relief, where they're having to file lawsuits to try and get access to evidence to conduct an investigation. And they're having to file a lawsuit against the federal government, which we have people in this audience that know those always run parallel to each other. You have a state level investigation and a federal investigation, and there's cooperation about which will proceed first, who will conduct what forms of it. And that has operated very well in this country for a long time, and suddenly now people are being elbowed out of being able to provide that kind of independence that's necessary. Right? Yeah, it's so important.
Rachel, did you want to talk about things that your organisation is thinking about in terms of broader safeguards for democracy, some of the proposals you guys are working on?
Sure. So, one of the things that I think is important to always, I think we kind of touched on this a little bit, is the connectivity between the independence of the prosecutor and our courts, right? So at the Alliance for Justice, what we essentially, one of our major priorities is fighting to make sure that we have fair, independent, qualified movement lawyers on the bench. So lawyers who have fought for people, who have been civil rights lawyers, public defenders, workers' rights lawyers, union lawyers, that's who we want on the bench. But right now, what we're seeing is an attempt to see these Trump loyalists on the bench. So a lot of what we have been working on at the Alliance for Justice is making sure there's public awareness about these nominees and really fighting back against them. And one of the things that we have seen at the local level, at the federal level, is that our courts have been that sort of backstop a lot of times. We've seen when the Justice Department or this administration attempt to have an unconstitutional overreach, that the courts are the ones that sort of are that backstop. So I think keeping that in the back of our minds, because the courts tend to be kind of sectioned off as this separate issue, but it's so core and just central to all of it. And one thing I'll say too, just in kind of circling back to what this group can do and how the Hill can be thinking about prosecutorial independence, I do think just continuing to say that this is not okay, it matters. When members speak up, when members continue the drumbeat of all of these actions are not okay, and making sure that the public understands and making sure that we are consistently reinforcing like a slush fund to benefit the president is actually really a bad thing, right? So I do think ways that senior level staffers who are quite honestly the backbone of Congress, I know as a former Hill staffer myself, finding ways to tee that up, to make sure that the members are consistently bringing this up so that the worst case scenario is it becomes normalized, where people start to tune out and people start to forget and start to think that this is normal for the prosecution function.
That's such an important point. I mean, when we think about Commonwealth's attorneys being called in front of Congress to discuss their prosecutorial decision on a local case, being subpoenaed to provide their working file, all of those things are so outside of what is appropriate authority for Congress to be exercising. They have no enforcement authority over local prosecutors. And, while it is a powerful body, that it does not reach to that. That independent decision-making at the local level that prosecutor makes is his or hers. And so having congressional hearings, I mean, Parisa is not the only person, right? Steve Dehghani has been called before. There's, I think, by our count, 11 local prosecutors who have received letters to come before Congress to talk about their sanctuary policies within their office and how they are making prosecutorial decisions at the local level. And those things are well outside of congressional authority and are things that I think, as you say, Rachel, so well, are things we should remember in those rooms and things that should be reinforced. And where possible, that we're not trying to subpoena people's actual prosecution file and the work product that's contained therein.
Well, and the hook that they're trying to use is the federal grants. And so they're acting like if you get federal grants, then we have authority to conduct oversight over your office. And that's just not legal. That's the Supreme Court has said that you can't coerce action by using federal grants.
Or wait them out to also fix the Tucker Act, for the Tucker Fact fans in the room.
Can you say more about that?
Well, it's the act that funnels all of these grant-based cases to a sleepy court called the Court of Federal Claims, and while that is a perfectly legal mechanism, it also forces grant recipients to slog through a court process that they shouldn't have to, when we all know that there are inappropriate motivations behind it, and it's just it's a procedural hurdle that can prove to be impossible for all but the most well-heeled grantees to survive.
Chris, I want to come back to you. We were talking a lot about political backlash, and I know that you're in touch with a lot of other prosecutors facing these challenges. Are prosecutors factoring the political backlash into decisions that they make? What are some of the dangers of that? When you're supposed to make decisions based on law and ethics, and then suddenly you're thinking about, well, I don't want to be subpoenaed, I don't want to be removed, I don't want to be recalled.
Well, I mean, I think that the goal of the subpoenas and the invitations and trying to pull federal grants is to get us to act differently and to scare people like us from running in the first place. And I think it would be unrealistic to say that we're not aware of the backlash, but awareness is different than allowing it to drive our decisions. And I'm really proud to stand with a group of the 9 prosecutors who created the Fight Against Federal Overreach. And we've had a tremendous amount of interest of people wanting to join and people wanting to participate in some of the trainings that we do. And so my hope is that it is not actually affecting, because once we're making different decisions because the spotlight is brighter, like you're not upholding the rule of law at that point anymore.
Rachel, I want to go you talk about bar associations and legal organisations, and do they have a role to play in all this? Like, what should their role be when it comes to this discussion?
Absolutely. So, when you think about the legal profession at large, it's so important to ensure that we are protecting, defending, and allowing the legal profession to do what it's supposed to do. When we think about the attacks on law firms that we have seen and how immediately that caused a lot of defection and a lot of folks to kind of obey in advance. One of the things that I think that is very important to think about when we think about, what is the impact of these, unlawful prosecutions by the Justice Department, the weaponization of the Justice Department. A big factor is the fear that it causes, right? And, when other nonprofits see, oh wait, if I'm too loud, that can mean a criminal indictment. Then nonprofits aren't out in the streets marching as loudly, right? Or when law firms see, oh wait, they might come after us, it might change the cases that they take, right? So I do think there is an element of bravery across the sectors of society that needs to be critical right now. And I say this often, but history is going to tell the story about how all of us, wherever we sit with the power that we have, whether we may be, the most junior level Hill staffer or an elected official, history will tell the story of what we did and how we stood up in this moment. And I think we all have some power. We have to exercise it, and we have to find ways to not obey in advance and to not allow that chilling impact.
And Cristine, I want to go back to you to talk about, one of the things that comes out in the report is, we start off with this progressive prosecutor movement, and then we have, disagreements over criminal justice policy that ultimately became these broader attacks on prosecutor independence itself. Can you talk a little bit about how that evolved or devolved, how we went from attacks on, policy issues or disagreements over policy rather to actually full-scale attacks on prosecutor independence?
Yeah, well, I think I'm in California where we saw some of the earlier attacks on elected local prosecutors, and those first came about as recall efforts, which are a democratic mechanism. I think they need some boundaries on them. I think they're a little bit too widely used currently. But an appropriate, I'm going to run against you, and I've got a different policy platform, and let's, may the best person win. We went from that and really having these efforts funded mostly by local interests, police unions, real estate interests that want to see something different on the local level. And that quickly moved, I think, as those early wins came in on that column, to then state level preemption. When we started to see states across the country, we counted about 27 states across the country past different levels of prosecutorial preemption. Removing people from office, creating oversight commissions that could remove people from office, state legislatures taking away authority over certain kinds of cases, mandating that the Attorney General be involved in cases. So we saw it across a range, but bills were proposed, in over half of the country. We saw these bills and many of them passed. And I think that now we have seen that state level preemption migrate to federal preemption. And now we have the federal government saying to states, actually, you don't have any authority over any of this. And not only that, we're going to come at you with the full force of the federal government and threaten you with potential investigation and prosecution if, as Parisa said, you dare have a different point of view on the matter. A lot of that state preemption in Georgia, for instance, largely suspected was targeted at Fani Willis because she brought a case against Donald Trump in his private capacity. We saw Alvin Bragg being brought, you're going to need to come to Congress and justify the fact that you brought a case. We saw investigation into Letitia James for having brought a case. And so essentially everybody that brought a case against Donald Trump in his private capacity has since been subject to political prosecution efforts. And most of those have failed, and most of those have failed because people in those roles have said, that is not based in the law or the facts. I'm not able to bring that case for you. We've seen, you've all read it in the news, 3 and 4 U.S. attorneys having to be solicited at the appointed level to try and get a case filed, jurisdiction shopping, all the things have been happening to try and be able to wield that more authority. So we've seen go from a very localized issue, like you might think a San Francisco or an LA issue, all the way now to where we have transmuted this into a massive federal operation. That's
Yes, someone go ahead.
Now, hearing Cristine and Rachel talk about this and the backlash, I feel like there is another lesson that we can all take forward, is that like progressive prosecutors and other criminal justice reformers have the gall to view accountability in a more holistic way, right? People hate that. They want jail or nothing, right? They want punitive responses to everything. Instead, we got restorative justice. Instead, we got diversion. Instead, we got working with other local officials to make communities stronger and more vibrant so that we didn't need to prosecute in the first place, right? These are the radical ideas that elicited so much backlash from the progressive prosecutor community. Well, when Rachel says, like, history is going to write the story about what we did now, there's also going to have to be an accountability effort here, right? And the way we're going to do it different is, it's also not just going to be about prosecution. It's going to be about a whole of society reckoning with our flirtation with fascism and how we're going to get back from the brink. And I think it's going to be about a mix of ideas that really get us to a place of truth and reconciliation like healing. And who knows that better than a bunch of folks who transformed what was previously a purely punitive exercise. So I think that's going to be a really good lesson to take forward.
Can I add, though, that there is a race element to this? Because not only did we have the gall to come in and say we should have a wide range of accountability, but we also came in and said, look, we have racial disparities in the system, and we are enforcing the laws differently to different people based on class and race. And so when we tried to protect the vulnerable, and when we tried to undo some of the racial issues that we have in this country, that's when we woke the bear up.
But this administration is based only on merit, so that's not an
But it happened though even within excuse me, it was before the administration.
cities.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what we really saw was America's racism showing, when we decided to start addressing racial disparities.
Well, and I think something that we talk about in the report is like the concept of prosecutorial discretion existing for a long time, but being used in a certain way, like not to prosecute financial crimes, not to prosecute certain high-level people. When you start using it for things like racial disparities, working class people, that's when you start to get the backlash.
Right.
I wanted to open up for questions, see if anybody in the audience had questions. You want to introduce yourself and ask your question?
Sure, I'm Paul Reese, just interested. Curious to ask the panel about your thoughts on the role of political parties in all of this, because what you are describing is normative. It's shocking violations of our party and political norms in this country. Is the response to this partisan? Like, should it be organized by Democrats, or should it come from civil society and the NGO community because it is such a normative violation?
Good question.
I'm sure we may all have different answers to it, so everyone should hop in. I come from a democratic state in democratic cities, and we experienced our versions of this, so I don't see it purely as a partisan issue. Now, it has gotten exaggerated in a way that is hard not to identify with one political party, but it is applicable to both. And I think everybody in power is susceptible to the temptation to use this power as conveniences them. Whether, maybe it doesn't feel as offensive when it's aligned with your values, but it is still a very real problem for organized society to have democratic norms. And so from where I sit on this issue, it is critically important that both parties embrace it, I think it's maybe the only way out of it, I don't know, I'm not the person that can answer that, but it would be wonderful for us all to agree that there are hallmarks in this society. Courts are a hallmark, prosecutors not being subject to political prosecution is a hallmark, and that both sides should, or more sides, all sides should agree that that's important.
You know, and I'll co-sign that because I do think, you know, the values that we're talking about are core to democracy. And, you know, maybe there's a question right now about who actually believes in these core values of democracy, right? Like, do we all believe in free press? Do we all believe in non-weaponization of the Justice Department, right? Like, it is a different moment, right? But you look at, you know, there have been some instances where the line has been crossed and you see bipartisan opposition. So, you know, that $1.8 billion slush fund, right? Suddenly that got too far and you had a bipartisan behind the scenes backlash and that resulted in that being abandoned, right? So I do think if we can get to a place where, you know, our colleagues on the Hill, where, you know, where we can kind of remove some of that political overture, right? And remind ourselves what democracy means to us and what we stand for. We have a lot of disagreements on policy. We have a lot of disagreements on a lot of things, but some of the things that we're seeing, law enforcement stopping the free press from speaking, or, you know, these members of Congress who made a video saying, you know, if it's an illegal order, disobey it, right? Like that's the Constitution. That's what we value, right? And that you could be subjected to a criminal federal investigation for that. It's wild. So I would say that the principles we speak of are very nonpartisan, bipartisan, and it's just a matter of how do we not allow it to be weaponized in the way that it has been politically weaponized.
So I don't think it's mutually exclusive. And I think right now, you know, I think what we need is a pro-democratic party and you know, to distinguish ourselves. And it can be bipartisan, but I think that inevitably, you know, there is one party right now that is more pro-democratic than the other one. And so I think that, and keeping people like us in place and keeping, you know, elected judges that are good in areas where judges are elected. So, like, we can't stop winning elections. We need to keep working on that as long as we have them. But so I think so. I don't think that the answer is mutually exclusive. Like, there's work that can be done on both sides.
Other questions? Yep, go ahead.
I think this is kind of a question in response to what you just said. I think it goes back to Abraham Lincoln, house divided among itself cannot stand. And if there's such core disagreement on a basic issue such as prosecutorial independence, how do you think you would go about convincing someone on the conservative side of your argument, especially if they're more aligned with President Trump?
I don't actually know the answer to that because I have not succeeded. So I think there are a lot of Republicans, and I think there are a lot of libertarians, and there's a wide swath of people that are convinced by evidence-based policies and that are convinced by the importance of prosecutorial independence, that want to uphold the rule of law. I mean, if you think about, like, half of the Bill of Rights is all about, you know, like protecting people from the government in criminal justice matters, right? And I think that there are a lot of very smart, very thoughtful people, regardless of what their perspective is. I just think that there's, like, if you don't believe in democracy, you're not going to accept the independence of a local prosecutor. Because I think it was Somiel that said it, that we undercut the authoritarian narrative. And so you can't believe in that. So I don't think that there is. But there's a whole lot of other people that, you know, may disagree on policies but agree on the independence of the prosecutors. And, you know, if you just take Virginia, for example, we have 120 Commonwealth attorneys, and we all are wildly different in our opinions. The one thing that we ever agree on is our discretion as prosecutors. That is the only thing we've ever come together unanimously to support.
And I'll just add, it's easier said from my vantage point, but I would also throw in, it seems to me there is an element of fear when it comes to members, Republican members, right, who may secretly or quietly believe that a certain action is inappropriate or crosses the line, but again, there is a permeated fear across sectors, across our society that, well, if I step up, right, he's gonna support my opposition candidate in my race, he's gonna come after me, right, and it's a real threat, right? So I do think, in vague terms, if there are ways to take the conversation quiet, to take the strategy behind the scenes, to not be a kind of out, like in a hearing, right, like, you're undemocratic, right, like in front of everybody, right, but to quietly kind of work those channels behind the scenes before decisions are made, and finding places where you can find that agreement, I do think we have seen some places where that has worked. I think it's hard, and I think the fear still remains, but I do think that's a strategy.
I also think that right now, it seems like we're in a very dark place, and that dark place might last a long time, but this too will also pass with all of our efforts, all of our concerted efforts. And I think you can appeal to people's long-term sense of the country and what kind of country they really want. He's 80, and not everybody in the country is, and they're going to want to live in a place, to our points, that what's good for the goose is good for the gander.
Let me ask you a quick follow-up on that. You guys get encouraged when you see things like, the other day the Senate passing legislation to kind of essentially take away big parts of the settlement, that there are things that happen that are like, okay, we've gone too far, and then you see some pushback. Do you get encouraged? Is that somewhere where folks can build off of, or are these like one-off incidents?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The tent is big, the water's warm. Absolutely.
Go ahead, Rachel.
And I was gonna say, there was also a conservative outcry on the indictment of SPLC.
Right.
Because of this fear, when you read the indictment and you read the charges that are just so, I'll just say, seem difficult to prove and find evidence for. But it's not even that you have to get the indictment, right? Like, you're under federal criminal investigation. That is the goal. That's the victory, right? Like, funders are afraid. You're wasting money on representation, right? So, but seeing at least, 5 to 10 different conservative voices speaking out against that, I think was also encouraging. I do think that at its core, there's a lot going on right now that makes you lose hope. But at its core, I do think the majority of us in this country do have certain shared values. And right now it's being tested. And again, like I said, I know that there's fear, and I know it's real fear, but history will tell the story. All of us, no matter what side of the aisle we are on, history will tell the story. Did you stand up or did you not? And the hope is that people will.
Well, I stood up for this whole panel. We'll go one more question. Go ahead.
Building on what you said in terms of working a quieter way to change things, with federal grants being a weapon, have thought of, or any other groups thought of, working with colleges and whatever coalition could pull everyone together and try to think of new strategies?
Sure. I'll say, for example, when the administration cut almost $1 billion from public safety grants, right, community violence initiatives, mental health initiatives, et cetera. From when I said earlier that some of these funding tactics were enough to starve these organizations, whether they technically had a legal mechanism to go to the Court of Federal Claims, et cetera. These federal grants were their lifelines, and without them, many of them were going to go under. So even though I happened to be at Democracy Board at the time and we brought a lawsuit wasn't going to resolve itself in time to save many of them. And they organized together and they created what was called a Community Violence Legal Network. And they went out and found legal representation for themselves, found alternative streams of funding, consolidated, they organized in a way that only this sort of existential threat could do. And I'm positive that is happening across sectors, across the environmental movement, across the reproductive rights movement, community violence intervention, all of that. This is what fascism forces you to do, and I think those kinds of coalition meetings are happening all the time. If you know of some that we should be, organizing as well, I'd love to know about them.
Right.
Thank you.
I'm going to wrap up a little bit with some final thoughts. This is like a three-parter for each of you. Tell me, we're going to go down the line very quickly. Tell me what's one big takeaway that you want people to have from today? How can people find out more about your work? And then I want us to end in an optimistic note. Tell us one thing that you're working on just now that you're excited about. So Sonia, we'll start with you.
Yeah, one takeaway is that you can criticize individual decisions from institutions without undermining in an undemocratic way those institutions themselves. It's a really hard tightrope to walk, but it's literally what we have to do right now. And so don't feel afraid that you have to be in one camp or the other. These are hard questions, but we can do it. It's what we must do. Oh man, part two.
I know,
Who's gonna win tonight?
Yeah.
Well, you can learn more about what our organization does at courtaccountability.org. Very similarly to Rachel's work, we overlap on a lot of stuff. We work on both reforming the Supreme Court and access to justice in America, as well as broader accountability for authoritarian actors. And one specific thing that we're working on that I think has a lot of momentum now, a little bit separate from the prosecutorial reform movement, is we need to reform the Supreme Court. And sadly, it took two horrific and racist opinions from the Supreme Court to awaken a lot of people to it, but we're woke now. I know that's a dirty word, but it's happening. And so if you want to see some meaningful changes to the Supreme Court and the lower courts, come talk to all of us.
Great. Rachel?
I'll try to remember all three. So number one, a takeaway. So I think the takeaway, there's so many takeaways, but one I would leave all of us with is we have to somehow think about how we are active in this moment, pushing back, standing up, calling out, while we're also preparing for a moment of rebuilding and innovation and excitement, and believing that that moment will happen, and knowing that, you know, in the worst situations where our institutions are demolished, maybe there's some silver lining in the fact that we can rebuild from scratch something more beautiful, something more equitable, something more just, right? And so in order to do that, there needs to be ideas, there needs to be cross-sector collaboration, there needs to be enthusiasm, and it's really hard to do both. It's really hard to be focused on like all the news every day. It's just like hard to keep up with, and to think about, you know, can I act, should I say something? But we have to be doing that while we're planning for the future, I would say. Number two, find us at afj.org. Follow us on all the social media platforms. And I'd say number three, one thing I'm excited about. So Alliance for Justice, we're an interesting organization because we have kind of two pillars of our work. One is defending, fighting for a just court system. And the other is defending and fighting for nonprofits. Most people know one or the other, nobody ever tends to know both. But in our defense of nonprofits, historically we have a hotline any nonprofit can call if they want to know compliance questions, like can I say that a senator is doing a bad job, right, as a 501c3 organization? We have online resources and tools, but what I'm really excited about is that we are actually providing free legal help to nonprofit organizations for the first time. So we just launched AFJ Law, where we're providing 101 support. So if you know of any nonprofit organizations, we began in DC, and then our hope is to spread to Texas next. And so if you know of any nonprofit organizations that might benefit from free sit-down legal support, and specifically in the area of compliance. So our entire mission on that side of our work is we want you to be bold, and so in order to be bold, you've got to know the law, and we will help you know the law. So, yeah.
Cristine?
Yeah, that's hard, it's hard, you're a three-parter. Yeah, exactly. It's hard in your 50s to have a memory, but I wrote it down. The first one, but my takeaway is prosecutorial independence can seem esoteric and niche, and if it does to you, it might be because it has not yet come to your doorstep. But there's no guarantees of that if we don't keep the guardrails on this. And you won't know how important it is until you're under the thumb of it, and it is a scary place to be. And I think In this country, we've had a lot of communities that have experienced that will say to you, this country hasn't really ever felt less than authoritarian to me, and I think we need to learn the lessons from that part of our history and carry it into this moment and recognize if we've had the privilege, either personally or professionally, to not know the boot of the government on our neck unlawfully and unjustly, that we need now pay attention, and we need to be sure that the most coercive power in our society against individuals is wielded extremely carefully. And that this is not about a professional privilege, the independence factor, it is about not having politics and inappropriate influence in our system. You can find us in this report, you can find us at prosecutorsalliance.org, we're on all the socials too. And the thing I'm excited about is what we hope comes from this launch of this report, the community that's here, the community that you all are connected to. I think for a long time, criminal justice has lived in its own silo, much for our own doing, and much because it is behind courtroom doors most of the time. But all of the best scholars will tell you the way we survive an authoritarian moment is mutual aid. It is working together, it is working across our issues, it is seeing our commonalities of the things we care about. That was so eloquently said by everybody up here. And so we're interested to work with you, we're interested to know what you care about on this topic. We want to show up on this work as a profession. There are many of us, Parisa is just one amazing example of that, but there are many of us around the country that want to be in this conversation. And we can win it if we all work together.
Great, Parisa?
So I want to leave you all with a little bit of a quote, a partial quote from Justice Jackson. And he said that the prosecutor has more control over life, liberty, and reputation than any other person in America. His discretion is tremendous. While the prosecutor at his best is one of the most beneficent forces in our society, when he acts from malice or other base motives, he is one of the worst. The qualities of a good prosecutor are elusive and impossible to define as those which mark a gentleman or gentlewoman. A sensitiveness to fair play and sportsmanship is perhaps the best protection against the abuse of power, and the citizen's safety lies in the prosecutor who tempers zeal with human kindness, who seeks truth, not victims, who serves the law and not factional purposes, and who approaches his task with humility. To me, like, everything that is good about prosecutors, I feel like has been it's been vulgarized. I don't even know if that's a word. But protecting that independence isn't just about protecting prosecutors. It's about protecting the idea that the law applies to everyone, and that justice isn't for sale, and it's not subject to politics. In terms of I wrote it down, how to find out about our work. Well, there's two ways to find out. Actually, multiple ways, actually. So Parisa for Justice is the personal/campaign side. The Commonwealth Attorney for Arlington and Falls Church website. It's a official county website, is another place to find out. The office and myself are on social media, not on X, but on all the other social medias. And you can always talk to Kara, who is our community engagement specialist, and who is here. And then what I'm optimistic about is that when we saw what was going on in Minnesota, it took a few phone calls for us to create the Fight Against Federal Overreach. And it happened literally in like 2.5 days. And that really gave me a lot of hope. I was in a place where I was feeling really helpless and wondering if this was even worth doing anymore. And the fact that we all came together and coalesced around a mission, and then you guys have been there, to some of our trainings and meetings, and we have other folks who've been involved in one way or another, and the fact that it's growing and the mutual aid is growing, like we're here to help each other, we're sharing briefs, we're sharing advice, we're sharing how to create tip hotlines, we're having tabletop exercises for the coming elections. And it really, that's what makes me optimistic, is that we are seeing that mutual aid happen in the profession.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking the panelists. Thank you everybody for being on today. We're going to have the bar open for a little bit longer, so please take advantage of that, and you're welcome to hang out and chat to the panelists. And again, thank you for coming.